You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Anthony Etherin.
Welcome to episode 20 of the Penteract Poetry Podcast. This episode is a launch special for Zoolalia by Luke Bradford, a collection of lipograms inspired by the animal kingdom. I met up with Luke a few weeks ago and began by asking him what inspired him to become a poet.
I am not sure exactly how I first got into poetry. I've been writing poetry in some form or another since I was young, probably since I was 14 or so. And in college, I was part of a performance poetry group, writing poetry specifically to be performed on stage. But it's only in the past few years that I've become more serious about working on and publishing poetry, and that's when I started to get into the world of constrained poetry, which is my big focus these days.
So that's quite interesting, starting with performance poetry. So I think a lot of people who are interested in constraints see the performance side as something they have to do rather than something they really embrace, because there's a, you know, we're all nerds really, aren't we, if we're doing constraint-based work. So we tend to be more introverted. But you did performance by choice, I assume. You weren't forced into it, so you must have enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's right. I enjoyed it a lot, and it was a very different style of poetry from what I'm focused on now. And it's interesting for me to compare the two. You know, everything that I work on now is definitely designed to be seen on the page. Even when there's no obvious visual element to it, it's definitely made to be seen. And so in the past few years, I haven't really done any readings or performance, and I've kind of moved away from that style.
So you haven't performed any of the poems from your books live?
I think that I have once. When I lived in Cambridge, I used to go to a poetry open mic at the Cantab Lounge for a few years. And I think that the last time that I went there, I performed one poem from Abacus, which was my first collection of constrained poetry. And so that was sort of during the transitional phase for me, when I was really starting to get deeper into constraint. And I guess that was the last time that I performed a poem on stage.
Okay, and I'm going to get you to read some later, so I hope.
Yeah,
I hope you're prepared. So, what was it about constraints then that got you back into poetry?
Yeah, so when I was in college, one way or another, I stumbled across Eunoia, which is Christian Book's most famous collection. I think that it was mentioned in a class or something, but I don't recall exactly. And I became pretty obsessed with that book and with Crystallography, which is an earlier collection by Christian Book. And at that point, I started playing around with constraints and started working on a few of the poems that ultimately ended up in Abacus, which was my first self-published collection. And I had this thought in the back of my head that I would always, I was always thinking about eventually putting together a real collection of constrained poetry, just because it was something that I felt like I was really interested in the sort of effect that it had on the style of the poems that were created. It's a very compelling idea to me that you can have this rule drive the voice of the poem in a way that might be unexpected or different from what you would naturally write. And so for many years, when I was, in my 20s, I thought about focusing more seriously on a collection of constrained poetry, really just based on my experience reading those two books and coming back to them again and again. And then finally, maybe 3 years ago, I kind of buckled down and decided to really put in the effort and focused for about a year on just writing constrained poems. And that's what led to my first collection and how I kind of started to get deeper into this world.
Yeah, how strong was the appeal of Constraint as a way of avoiding having to wait for inspiration? Because that was always important to me, that I didn't like it when I had a blank page in front of me and I couldn't write anything. And then when I started using constraints, suddenly that disappeared, because you can always write something if you've got the rules and a few bits of vocabulary.
Yeah, I think that that's a huge part of it, is that I could, I was working on writing every morning consistently, and sometimes feeling more inspired or less inspired. And when you're feeling less inspired, it's definitely valuable to be able to focus on a more mechanical part of the process, like gathering lists of words that obey a particular rule, or things that move the project forward, but that don't stare you in the face in the same way that a pure blank page with no restriction does.
Yeah, and so you mentioned as well that the constraints pushing you in directions you wouldn't naturally go in, which is related to that. And I've talked on the podcast before about how it's like collaborating with an alien. And another way to look at it would be collaborating with a machine. And I want to talk about this with you because, as you know, I'm not very good with computers, but you are. So I'd like to know to what extent you use technology in your poetry.
Yeah, so programming is another major interest of mine, something I've also been doing forever. So I started programming also around the time I was 14 and have been doing it, either as a hobby or professionally since then. So my overall interests have always been in the space of software, music, and language in some capacity. In terms of the ways that software and technology influences my poetry now, I am constantly using code that I write to analyze and tease apart text in different ways. So none of my poetry that I've published, with maybe one or two exceptions, is purely generated by code or created by a program, but I'm constantly using tools that I've created to, for example, take an existing text and find all the words that have some particular property, or to break down words into segments that I can use in other ways. For example, I've been getting more into palindromes recently, which is an area that I know you're extremely into. So writing code to find words that, when reversed, can be broken down into usable chunks. So that's a huge thing for me. So I'm constantly using my own code, and I'm also constantly using online tools that will kind of retrieve lists of different words in different ways. Words that either match a particular pattern in terms of the letters that they have, or match a particular length but are related to some topic, and all that sort of thing. So technology is definitely a huge part of my process.
Yeah, I know a few people who write palindromes who are also programmers, and one of them recently was kind enough to send me a list, and I got quite excited about this. I can expand my palindromic vocabulary. The difficulty is, because the program is just set up to find anything, you really have to wade through all these completely useless bits of language that technically work, but you're never going to want to use them. It's obscure words and things that just wouldn't at all sound nice in a palindrome. So I suppose that some refinement needs doing on that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and that's something that I've struggled with, is how do you get the computer to give you things that you actually want? And one way that I do that when I'm using my code to retrieve things is I feed it all of the poetry that I've written so that I can be assured that the words that it's pulling from, that the kind of set of words is actually a set of words that I'd be interested in using. So that's one refinement that I've found useful, is to kind of feed my own work back in some way.
Wow, so that's really like a back and forth between this collaboration between man and machine. That you're telling it in advance the kind of things that feel like your voice.
Yes, exactly.
Because it's strange when people ask me about to what extent I use anagram generators, and there are lots of them around. I generally try to avoid them because of this, because it doesn't give you your own voice back. It's too much of the machine. And some people interpret that as me saying that a machine can never write the way a human can because of, it lacks a soul. But that's not what I mean at all. If anything, I mean that the machine just isn't good enough yet. That once the anagram generator is also programmed to understand meter properly, once it's able to understand the rules for making strong imagery, once it figures these things out, it's going to be better than any human poet, and I'll be out of a job.
It's possible, although I feel like what we're going to see is just an expansion of this collaboration. I also love anagrams and anagram poems, and I am always so frustrated by the lists of really useless anagrams that come back from an internet anagram generator. But then if I can take that and filter it through some code that I've written that's looking for words that either I know are words that I like or that relate to some topic I'm going after, that kind of, that's one example of me collaborating with technology in a way that's personal to me. And I feel like as the technology gets better and better, maybe poets won't be out of a job, but we'll be able to use these tools in more and more expansive ways over time, which I think is really interesting.
Have you thought about programming poems or even prose that's where you do just let it go all to the computer? Almost you set the parameters so strictly towards what you're interested in that you can just press a button and let the computer write something.
Yeah, there's one piece I wrote that's in that direction, appeared in the issue of Guest magazine that you edited, which the piece is titled Annuit Coeptus, and it essentially is a pyramid-shaped list of numbers just organized by increasing length. And so that was a case where the program generated the entire poem kind of at the push of a button. And the result was something that appealed to me aesthetically enough that I felt like it was, something to be published as is. But I think where my interests lie generally, I'm much more inclined to have work that involves a human touch or my own expression in collaboration with technology.
Yeah, me too, definitely. Since you mentioned that poem, one of your most successful poems or suites of poems is your Labyrinth. And so that's concrete poetry, but obviously with this constrained aspect and also computational aspect. I'd ask you how you made those, unless it's a secret. But
No,
I mean, I wouldn't understand anyway if it's very technological, but listeners would.
It's actually extremely low tech, the method. There's no code involved. I use a program called Adobe InDesign, and essentially I start from a completely filled in grid of short lines that are separate elements, and then I just delete them and copy and paste them, almost like bricklaying or something like that. And the poem is just a result of kind of the labor of making different letter shapes fit together, and then after that point, finding a path through the maze that I can create without completely destroying the visibility of the letters that I'm trying to convey.
Okay, so it's essentially a trial and error.
Yeah.
lot of constraint-based poetry is trial and error too. Certainly mine is. You know, it's all revision. It's that the editorial process starts once you start writing.
Definitely,
it's just editing.
Yeah, heavy editing. And many of my poems come together over months and years of tinkering and editing, rather than being written all at once.
So, well, before we talk more about constraint, should give it some context here by mentioning the book that we're launching with this podcast. So, First of all, the question on everybody's lips: what is it called? How do you say it?
I knew this was coming. I pronounced the book's title Zoolalia. Other pronunciations that I feel comfortable with are Zoolalia, 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 Zoolalia. As long as that first L doesn't get dropped completely, then I'm happy. But my top pronunciation is the full 5 syllables, Zoolalia. And this is a very obscure or somewhat invented word that literally means animal speech.
And the book is, of course, it's inspired by animals, using what's called the Beaupresant constraints, a type of lipogram. Could you explain what that is?
Yes, for sure. So a Beaupresant traditionally is a poem that allows only the letters in a person's name, which is also the title of the poem. In the case of the poems in Zoolalia, each poem allows only the letters in the animal's scientific name, or binomial name, also known as its Latin name. So each poem uses a unique set of letters that's specific to that animal.
And do you have some with you that you could perhaps read then? I told you I'd do this. So the first performance in how many years?
Yeah, the first performance. Well, actually, no, that's not true. I have done an audio recording, but this will be, the first time recording a performance of multiple poems in many, many years. So let's see. The first one that I would like to read is one of the first ones that I wrote for the collection, which kind of inspired me to keep going with it and turn it into something bigger. This is called I. Dabentonia madagascariensis. An eerie messenger dressed in obsidian, its orange irises near incandescent, as radiant as gemstones. It meanders, murmuring in a dim arbor. A somber, taciturn demigod, unseen, near insane, as enigmatic as a secret code. Disturbed dreamer, strange astronomer, grim insomniac. A sinister, misunderstood simian, damned ambassador to an ancient underground nation. It digs at grubs, one digit as enormous as an antenna. It rises at moonrise, as a red moon rises, and murders us in our dreams. This next one is reticulated python. Malaopython reticulatus. An unholy hallucination. An iconic elephantine South Asian serpent, the centerpiece in an ancient satanic ritual. A chthonic telepathic pharaoh. Sapient, stylish, psychic, psychotic. Its reptilian eyes alert, remorseless, as inhumane as any tyrant's. Its relentless muscular constriction as lethal as any poison. It counts corpses as easily as an accountant counts coins. A cryptic necromancer, the consummate monstrosity, phantom architect to a systematic trauma. Enormous, ominous, sinuous, shapeless. It annihilates us on autopilot. Yes, it eats us too. Its suit, an ornate tortoiseshell satin hose. Its torso, its tail, its toes. A slippery, charismatic con artist, as ephemeral as a rumor, that smiles a malicious smile. A taciturn plastic colossus, unsentimental, silent, stealthy, ruthless, tireless, soulless. This next one is Hellbender, and for listeners who don't know, Hellbender is a very large, ugly salamander that lives in the eastern United States. Hellbender, Cryptobranchus alleghaniensis. The big one, an oily, elongate octogenarian, gluttonous, greasy, as shiny as an unguent, lying silently in an obscure pool. A strange bachelor uncle carrying a Cuban cigar, surly, lugubrious, unapproachable, eating tiny crustaceans. A solitary creature, laconic, lonely, at least partially nocturnal, unsightly, as listless as a slug, an aging, insatiate giant, as slippery as a coelacanth. And finally, one of the last poems that I wrote for the collection, Black Widow, Latrodectus mactans, an occult seductress, a cruel seamstress, soulless, soundless, slender-armed, austere as round as a stone, a murderous, scarlet-ornamented contessa, cold, remorseless, calculated, as mute as a doll.
Fantastic, thank you. You obviously have a very keen interest in zoology. We will pronounce it zoology. Zoology. So, so where did this come from? This interest come from? Is it something you've always found interesting?
You know, it's hard to pin down exactly. I think that I've always liked animals and enjoyed animals, but I think that in terms of my poetry, it developed as sort of a natural, it was born of constraint. And what I mean by that is when I started playing around with rules and defining terms using a restricted set of letters, in particular in my previous collection, which is titled Glossology, I found that animals were the most appealing subject matter to me because they have so much personality and they can be so heavily personified, and we can relate to them in so many different ways. And so I think that rather than arriving at this collection from an existing interest in animals, I think I arrived at it from working with Constraint and finding that that was where I found the most exciting possibilities.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating as well how certain constraints lend themselves to certain topics. With palindromes, for example, you can write about the moon, the sun, and the stars quite easily. You've got the right words there that they naturally fit with palindromes. Smut as well is another one with palindromes. I try to stay away from, but you know, it's tempting occasionally. And apparently that's true across all languages. Across all languages, unless people who write palindromes are just obsessed with sex. I don't know.
Yep. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, each rule creates a different voice, you know, and exploring those different voices is something that I'm very, very interested in. And in the case of this collection, it's very much about finding cases where the particular set of letters for a specific animal seems to speak to the animal's personality in some way. And so in each of those poems that I read, I felt that the set of words that I was able to use was actually really well tied to my image of that animal. And animals where that didn't happen just didn't end up in the collection. So it's the cream of the crop, so to speak.
Well, yeah, you've got the whole animal kingdom to play with there, so that's quite nice. That's a nice loosening of the constraint that you only have a slim volume to fill, and you've got millions and millions of species to choose from.
Yes, absolutely, and that goes back to that, you know, idea of having something mechanical that you can do to move the project forward. In this case, it was sifting through endless lists of species and saying, okay, can I do something with a red-eyed tree frog or not? And then moving on to the next frog, and then from there on to different types of salamanders, and trying to come up with every animal I could possibly think of and giving it a shot.
Yeah, there's always this aspect of discovery to constraints, and presumably you hadn't already memorized the Latin name of every animal, so you've got to discover these names and then see what was possible.
Yeah, that's right. I knew very, very few Latin names before this, and that's actually kind of a fun esoteric piece of knowledge that I've gained over the course of writing this. Is now I know a pretty wide array of Latin names of animals, which is fun.
Some of these Latin names are quite long. Were there any that you thought I can't include that because it just uses too many letters? If there's a Latin name that uses about 19 letters, then it's probably not much of a constraint.
Yeah, I don't know if I ever came across one where I said that's just too many letters. Some of the ones that I just read, I think were the kind of maximum number of unique letters that I found anywhere. So Daubintonia madagascariensis, I believe, has 14 unique letters, and reticulated python might be similar. And so each of those, I felt like, gave me a pretty hefty selection of words to choose from, but it still felt like a constrained and unique voice. And I'm not sure what the minimum number of letters is in this collection, but it's probably around between 7 and 9 unique letters in some cases.
Yeah, and you're very limited there.
Yeah.
I have used this constraint too, and it does get tough once you get below 10 letters. Yeah, of course, it depends on the letters too. If you haven't got an A or an E in there, that makes it a lot harder.
The farthest I've gone in my previous collection, Glossology, there's a poem titled DNA, which only uses the letters D, N, and A. But obviously that starts to push into more of a kind of conceptual territory, and it's not necessarily going to read as a fluid poem at some point.
It's hard to be lyrical with.
Yeah. Yeah.
But some of the poems in Zoolalia are very short as well. You've got the whole range. Some take a whole page, and some are they are minimalist pieces.
Yeah, and in some cases, that's because of feeling like I was so restricted that that's all I can do, and in other cases, it's because I just felt like that was the best possible poem for that animal. So one of the shortest is Lion, Panthera Leo, and the entire poem is just antelope threat. Yeah. And there's something very appealing to me of that 2-word phrase. Says a lot about a lion. It uses every letter, and it's almost like discovering a gem in the language. That is almost a more pure act of discovery in constrained writing, to find something that's so minimal.
Yeah, well, this is when constraint is also about restraint. You don't want to do too much. You don't want to just show off. I mean, we get this in the palindrome world. It's sometimes better to just have one snappy line than to go on and on for pages. Sometimes the most elegant solution is something very simple.
Yes, and palindromes are something that I've been getting gradually more into over time. It's such a heavy rule. It's a very extreme constraint, and so I find that it's almost impossible for me to write a long palindrome that appeals to me poetically. I think you're definitely someone who has kind of pushed the boundaries of real poetic content in terms of imagery and the atmosphere that it creates. And I think palindromes appeal to me to some extent, but as you can see from Zoolalia, I think I'm more naturally drawn to rules that are a little bit lighter, that allow a little bit more freedom of expression rather than something that you can kind of beat your head against and get very frustrated with because it lets you do so little.
In general, there's, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, the two approaches towards constraints. There is a minimalist approach and there is a maximalist approach, or you might call it economy versus excess. And I go back and forth between these because I might one day, I get in certain moods, I want to say, okay, this palindrome is also going to be a sonnet and it's going to have all these other constraints going on. And I have this very maximalist view of it and I want to do the most elaborate thing ever. But then a lot of the time, as you can tell from my tweeted poems, sometimes I want that very simple, elegant crystal. I mean, you definitely seem like someone who leans more towards that style. Antelope Threat is a good example of it. A lot of people would have been tempted to go on and see what else was there and build a longer poem out of it. But you think, no, just that's enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
And alongside Zoolalia, we're also publishing Lip by Franco Cortese. And Franco's attitude, I think, is a bit more excessive. Just, he's interested in the limit case and taking this rule and doing everything that can possibly be done with it. Hence why his book's 5 times longer than yours.
Yes, and I think it's very interesting, that to have these published at the same time and be able to compare and contrast them. That the fact that they're built on the same fundamental rule, but they go in such wildly different directions, just shows you how wide the array of possibilities is within the world of constraint writing, even within one particular type of rule.
They're completely different books, but they're both works of lipograms. So it's fascinating. Are you tempted to try something that's a bit crazier and takes on more than one constraint at a time?
Ooh, it's a good question. I think in some cases, yes. I found that if a rule is not guiding the voice of the piece enough to the point where I don't feel inspired to get it to a point of completion, then I've thought about, okay, how can I add in other restrictions and other ways of limiting this. But I don't think that I'll ever approach the kind of spider web of constraints that you've done with some of your pieces, where it's almost an acrobatic effort to have any language meet all the requirements that you lay out. I think for me, the difficulty of that is less appealing than the kind of freedom of playing within a simple rule.
One of the things that led me to try and combine constraints is you have very different types of constraint that you can stick together. So they're not just, you wouldn't just have letter-based constraints, you'd have metrical constraints. And of course, I got into constraints in the first place through the path of formal poetry. Is that something you're interested in? Because I think you seem to have the mentality of someone who would write sonnets and the like.
I have not written really formal poetry with a strict meter or strict rhyme scheme in a long time. I think that in the case of something like a sonnet, I feel like on its own, it's not heavy as a rule as some of the things that I generally work with, and it appeals to me less because it's a looser restriction. But then when I think about it in combination with other constraints, I guess maybe it comes back to this idea of letting a single rule sort of speak for itself. In the case of each of these animal poems in Zoolalia, being able to state the rule very simply and then kind of making the statement as an artist that this is what I consider my finest work within this specific and simple rule.
You're familiar with triolets, that form. Well, maybe that's, I'm not telling you what to do, but maybe I'd like to, thing is, I would like to see a Luke Bradford triolet, because it's a bit more, because it's shorter than a sonnet and you've got the repeated lines, there's a bit more of a constraint to it. And yeah, I'm just curious to see what you would do, because I think it would suit your mentality.
Yeah. All right. Maybe I'll give it a shot.
The challenge, laying down the challenge.
Laying down the gauntlet.
Yeah. So, moving away from formal poetry, back to Constraint. Where do you see the position of Constraint now in the poetry world? In particular, where do you see the position of poetry that's generative and that isn't really about feelings or opinions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I should preface this by saying I'm not great at keeping up with overall trends in poetry because my interests are so specific. So I follow a lot of what's going on in kind of the constraint corner of the poetry world. But my impression of where we are overall is essentially constrained writing, or writing under the types of heavier constraints that I'm most interested in, has always been sort of relegated to the fringes of writing. And I don't really see that changing very much. I think there is definitely, in mainstream poetry today, even when poems are very cryptic or inaccessible, there's definitely a high value placed on emotion and meaning and identity in a way that constrained writing deliberately moves away from. And I guess at the opposite end of the spectrum from that kind of mainstream, meaningful sort of poetry is conceptualism. And I've toyed with conceptualism a little bit. And you have really extreme cases of conceptual writing nowadays, where, a poet like Kenneth Goldsmith will take the New York Times and transcribe it verbatim and publish that as a book of poetry. So that's kind of at the far end of removing expression from the work of poets. And I see constraint as fitting somewhere in the middle of allowing expression but limiting expression. Like you said earlier, it's like collaborating with an alien or a machine. You're collaborating with the language itself. But in terms of the trends, or where it's headed, I feel like if you look back over the centuries at where palindromes or lipograms have sat relative to other poetry, they're always kind of at the fringe, and I feel like that's destined to continue for the foreseeable future.
We'll see what Penteract Press can do.
Yes, I'm rooting for you.
Do you ever think about, because you mentioned conceptualism, do you ever think about poetic movements, and in particular, have you got any desire to start one, or or to be part of a group that starts one? Do you think you could make a difference that way?
I think, I don't know if I've thought about it in a very concrete sense of getting a group of poets together and kind of consciously deciding to start something specific. I do think that I feel right now that my interests in poetry are very specific and very narrow. I'm ultra focused on constraint and this particular species of constraint that is a simple rule that allows some freedom of expression. Usually the rule is just based on which letters are available or how many letters are in the word. And so I think for me, I envision my career as a poet just following that track and seeing how far I can take that. And I would love to see constrained poetry in general pick up steam and be a kind of stronger force overall. But I'm not sure if I feel like it's possible to turn that into a real movement or yeah.
And things don't have, you don't have to start a movement. It's not something that every poet has to think about. It's quite possible to just say, well, I like doing this stuff, so I'm going to do this. And I don't care if it changes the world, around me. I don't care if it changes the entire poetry scene. And I think that's fair enough.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would definitely love to see more of it. It's something that I crave, especially it's a small world of constrained poetry, and I get very excited about the work that appears in that world. And if there was more of it, I would love to consume more and be inspired by more and more of it. So whatever we can do to give it more momentum, I think is good.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's one of the reasons I feel I have to write so much, just because there isn't a lot out there, and it's remarkable. Because as someone who's running a press that wants to promote this kind of poetry, I'm looking for it, and there really aren't many people doing it. Maybe we could do a shout out on this podcast. If you're not sure what type of poetry to do, this is the one. There's a gap in the market.
Yeah, I think part of the reason that it's less popular is that if you just start to play around with writing under constraint, then the initial result that you get after an hour or two is not very good. You won't be satisfied with it. You won't be satisfied with where it's going. I think it takes a lot of labor to get to the point where it actually feels worthwhile and feels like you end up with a product that you're satisfied with. Not to say that other types of poetry don't require labor, but I think with something like free verse, in some cases, it can be like a lightning bolt. You sit down, you write something off the top of your head, and just because of whatever confluence of factors, it turns out beautifully. I think with constrained writing, in a lot of cases, it just is not going to be that same sort of lightning flash.
Yeah, I wonder if you really have to be into another type of poetry first and then evolve to constraints. I mean, certainly, like I say, I was writing formal poetry, and then I introduced constraints. If I just started out writing palindromes and anagrams, like you say, I might have just given up after my first few attempts. Yeah. Instead, I was able to learn that alongside doing the sonnets. And then you have experience with your performance poetry, and effectively that poetic instinct you then combined with your interest in programming, and so that's how you got there. So you didn't just throw yourself in at the deep end.
Right.
So you've done 2 books now with this Vauprezant liphogram. Is there a third? Will your next book be another on that theme, or do you think you want to try something else for the next?
I don't think that there will be another, at least not immediately. And right now, I'm not sure exactly what the next big project is going to be. I have a number of things that are kind of in the early stages, and we'll see which one kind of grabs hold of me and gets all the way to the point of being a complete collection. One that I'm interested in playing around with more is backronyms or contrived acronyms. So designing a text to have its initial letters of words fit existing terms. And that is, it ends up producing things in some cases that are even more minimal little gems of language. And so that's something I'm starting to play around with and may become the next big project.
I know you've also been working on some translations under constraints, where you take a poem and then you might say, well, we published a leaflet last year, or was it the year before? Yes, the year before. Last year, I kind of forgotten last year happened.
Yeah.
But the year before, the Mona Lisa poem.
Yeah. Yes.
Which I can't remember the name of the original poet. You'll have to describe this to me.
Yes. So this was a very strange piece from the beginning. So I took a poem which is titled Mona Lisa, which was published by W.B. Yeats under his own name. But in fact, what he was doing was adding line breaks to a piece of prose that he had taken from a book about the Renaissance from the 1800s by Walter Potter. And so what I did, if listeners haven't seen this, is rewrote the piece so that every word uses exactly 4 letters. And so this constraint of every word with exactly 4 letters is something that I've been playing around with for a really long time. There's a long poem in Abacus that follows that rule. But in this case, I was very attracted to the idea of taking a poem that had already been altered and recontextualized in some way, and then altering it again and recontextualizing it into the world of constrained writing. And a similar piece that I published late last year is called Salt, which is under the same rule, and that's a rewriting of Ezra Pound's poem, The Seafarer, which is itself a translation of an Old English poem called The Seafarer from some hundreds of years ago. So yeah, this is probably one of the more strange directions that I've gone in my work, is this kind of almost mechanical translation of an existing work into a rule. And in this case, the rule of 4-letter words appeals to me so much that I really liked the way that these pieces turned out. And so that's another rule that I've considered expanding into an entire collection of its own, having a collection where every word in every poem is exactly 4 letters. But we'll see. We'll see if it ever actually gets there.
Yeah, I saw Salt. It was published online.
The Aesthetic Directory.
Okay. Yeah, and I saw this, and of course it reminded me of the Mona Lisa one. I thought, I did wonder if this is part of a bigger, a collection, a book perhaps. But so yeah, maybe we'll see.
Maybe. Yeah, and I think that my general pattern is I start hammering away with a particular rule, and then eventually, if it generates enough content that I am, completely satisfied with, then it becomes a collection. So, yeah, it's always a case of kind of waiting and seeing where it ends up in the end.
Yeah, constraints based around letter counts are, it's something I feel like I should do more of. I've written a few poems that way because it's quite good fun, but it does have its frustrations too, doesn't it? I think, when I've done it, I've often combined it with meter, and that gets tricky because, especially with 4 letters, because you haven't really got many words beyond 1 syllable.
Yeah.
And of course, you have your own musical considerations whether you're writing outside of formal meter. Do you find that a problem?
I find it's definitely difficult to find the right rhythm if you're using a letter count constraint. And in a lot of cases, it means that editing goes on forever. Breaking apart phrases in different ways, using different kind of helper words to make the line flow a little bit better. And in the case of using only 4-letter words, if you don't put a lot of time into it, it can end up sounding very unnatural. So one thing that was nice about Salt is that I was aiming for this very archaic sounding voice. And so it uses thee and thou and a lot of archaic kind of grammatical constructs. And obviously it's not in any real historical dialect, but the fact that it's meant to sound old-fashioned allows it to kind of go down different paths to have a more, what I thought was a more fluid sounding voice.
Yeah, definitely. It's always good when you find these cheats, isn't it? These little ways around the constraint.
Yeah.
I always enjoy it. You know, in palindromes, it's finding a subject where you've got useful nouns to use. I've just finished a suite about ancient gods, and so I can use like Ra. Very useful in the palindrome.
Yeah, a good short fragment that appears in reverse quite a lot. That's great.
Are you planning a book of concrete poetry after the success of your Labyrinth?
I have actually not thought about a full collection of concrete poetry. I think, for whatever reason, to me, each Labyrinth poem feels like it kind of stands on its own. So I've been kind of publishing them as isolated pieces here and there. But it's possible someday, if I have a wide enough variety that I feel like it stands on its own as a book, maybe I'll do that.
You do seem to have a lot of ideas anyway, so is there anything else that you'd like to do?
I have a lot of kind of early works in progress that I am not so sure where they're going to go. One is a collection of reverse lipograms, so poems in which every word must contain a certain letter. And I have this dream of a collection with one of those for every letter of the alphabet. But it's something that I haven't quite found my footing with yet. And other things that I've been putting energy into recently are palindromes. But I do have sort of a love-hate relationship with palindromes. So in all these cases, it's sort of, a question of putting in labor and seeing what results come out, and then picking and choosing which pieces I'm most satisfied with and which to publish alone and which to try to kind of carry the torch and turn into an entire larger project.
Well, look, I look forward to seeing whatever you do, because your work's always fascinating. And best of luck with Zoolalia. We're calling it
that. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for having me on the podcast. This is my first ever podcast interview also, so that's exciting.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.